Hi, my name is Gennaro Cataldo, and I'm here again in another of our series, Revere Another Time. I'm with my friend and former classmate Don Zolo, who has done a great deal of research on World War II and some of the historic events that happened with Revere residents during World War II. And today we're going to be talking about one of the Revere residents who was a prisoner of war during that time. Don, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, first of all, to be a prisoner of war and what these prisoner of war camps were like?
Well, it was not nice, obviously.
Obviously.
Yeah, and the subject today is going to be Lieutenant Harold Noel, who coincidentally was an uncle to a classmate of ours, the late Joanne Noel, who lived at 99 Ridge Road, and Lieutenant Noel had that same address,
I think we all spent a lot of good times over at Joanne's house.
Right. And the last time I saw Joanne was at a 59 luncheon, and I asked her about her uncle, and she more or less confirmed a lot of the stuff that I'm going to tell you today.
Okay.
So, I mean, she was aware of him. But to answer your question first, what was it like? The research, I've done a lot of research, which includes the Revere Journal. I've done some research online and also got some research from the Navy Library. From Navy Library comes some very interesting facts that I'll tell you. In total, America had 130,000 of its troops that were taken as prisoners of war between Japan and Germany. Now, most historians, whether they're amateur historians or full-blown military historians, will tell you that the brutality of the Japanese prison war camp system was terrible. I mean, they were just the worst. And if you were, well, 27,000 of our troops wound up in Japanese POW camps. 33% of them died while there.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea. But you're going to probably say, well, what was it like in the German camps? Well, in the German camps, the numbers are far more better. 2 to 4% of Americans died in German camps.
Now, were these people killed by the Germans and
Well,
the Japanese, or they just because
They
of
were
disease
either,
and
a lot of it in the case of the Japanese system, they were beaten, they were not fed, they were used for terrible forced labor. There was no medications, no health care, no nothing. Of all the countries in World War II, Japan and Russia were the only two who were not part of the Geneva Convention. Even the Germans recognized and held to the accords that go with the Geneva Convention. Now, the numbers are only part of the story with regard to Germany. Statistically, you're better off in a German prisoner of war camp if you're an American, an Englishman, or a Frenchman. However, if you were black, of which there were a few, I will admit, or if you were Jewish or if you were Polish, the numbers are way against you if you were in a German camp. On the other hand, Russian camps were not that much better either for Germans, especially who were captured and sent there. There was a saying that they had during the war, if you were a German soldier, especially starting from 1944 onward, you were better off in an American prisoner of war camp because the Americans fed you better. The Americans provided medical services for you. The Americans had medications and other general supplies that you would need. And in addition to that, the Americans actually paid the prisoners of war that they had to do work.
They paid them?
They paid them, but the pay was only good to be used in an American PX, which is like a general store. It's called a post exchange. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, there were a number of German POW camps scattered throughout the United States. You had some in Dorchester. You had some on the islands in Boston Harbor. So they'll give you an idea of what it was like.
Tell us a little more about Lieutenant Noel and how did his military career begin?
Well, most of my research on Lieutenant Noel is going to come from the Revere Journal of August 16, 1945, pages 1 and 9. And he was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Eben Noel. They lived on, as noted before, 99 Ridge Road. His military career started on February 2nd, 1942. He was chosen to be a navigator on a B-24 crew. He went to a place that nobody knew of in 1943 when he took up his training. But later on, about some 20 years later, it would become rather famous. He was in Selma, Alabama. Mm-hmm. As I said, no one knew at the time what role that would play in the historic civil rights struggle.
Right, of course.
But while he was there, he was trained as a navigator for a B-24. His stateside service was over roughly around November of '43, and he was sent over to Europe.
Don, tell me, after his training as a navigator, where did he go and what did he do?
After his training, he left stateside, went directly over to the European theater of war. Mm-hmm. He was stationed at an air base in Italy. And in May of '44, he was returning, him and his crew were returning mm-hmm. from a bombing mission in France. On the return home, they ran out of gasoline.
Wow.
Not really an enviable position to be in. Mm. They were all forced to parachute out. Mm-hmm. He parachutes, and he lands in a tree. Luckily, he didn't get hurt because most of the time, if you landed in a tree, it was a serious injury all the way up to death. He manages to free himself from the tree, and this is where what I call like a heart-pounding drama begins to unfold. He now is off on his own. He's in a foreign country. He can't speak the language. But somehow or other, he encounters this young Italian boy who must have had some entrepreneurial spirit in him mm-hmm. because he's on a bicycle, and Lieutenant Noel wants to get the bicycle. Somehow or other, they communicate between one another. He winds up giving the kid all the change that he had on him, plus a pen and a ring for the bicycle. So now I think his heart is pounding just a little bit less slightly. He's a little bit happier. He's off pedaling. But an hour or so later, he gets jumped by 4 or 5 Italian fascists. They call black shirt Italian fascists. And they dutifully take him over to German intelligence. So I would assume his heart had to start pounding again.
Do you think that the boy actually turned him in?
Well, this is going to remain a matter of conjecture because we don't know. The article in the journal does not mention anything about it. I don't think Lieutenant Noel is still living. If he was, I would like to ask his opinion on that. I would think that if he had gone for an hour, there might not have been that long.
Probably happened. It
right.
Probably happened.
It could have or it could not. As I say, it's going to be a matter of conjecture from a historical standpoint. Mm-hmm. So now he gets processed into the German prisoner of war camp. And he's going into a prison camp system here in 1944. And any prison of war operation being run in Europe in 1944 was not a nice place to be in. And the reason why it wasn't a nice place to be in is something I call situational irony. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that the Germans have fewer supplies, they have fewer medical medications that they can give, they have to take personnel from the prison camp system and use them elsewhere. And the reason for this was, ironically, the Americans, their bombing, their interdiction of the German supply lines became so much more efficient as the war progressed. So every time they would try to get supplies to, say, a prisoner of war camp, the Americans were destroying that. So in reality, they didn't know it at the time, but they were really hurting their own people, their own Allied prisoners who were in German prisoner of war camps. But Lieutenant Noel gets processed into the German system, and he's there for about a year before the war ends. He gets transferred several times, and I assume the reason for that was as the Americans drew closer into the heart of Germany, they kept moving prisoners of war because they didn't want them to be freed by the Allies.
Right. So they kept going from camp to camp throughout Germany.
From camp to camp. Now, the war was over, and you would think, and in fact I know for certain, that all of these guys just wanted to get home. Yeah. But there's such a paperwork system that they have to go through. They have to go through an out processing in Europe. So you say, okay, we're all done with that. We're going home, guys. Great. No. You had to go to an Army Air Corps redistribution center if you lived on the East Coast, and that was in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So now he's there. In the meantime, it must have been so painful to be on American soil, yet not be with your wife, your family. But eventually he did make it back to Revere with his wife. He did live in Revere. I believe he went into partners with his brother, who would be Joanne Noel's father, in the painting business, and lived the rest of his life here in Revere.
Fantastic. Now, some of the other stories we had heard about other people that were in the war and were war heroes never talked about their experience. What
No.
about him? Did he give any indication about what it was like?
I really don't know. Joanne, when I talked to her, she never mentioned it. But I mean, she knew about it, but she didn't say if he talked about it. If I had to take a guess, I would say no, because the normal mode for most of them was not to. In fact, usually if somebody was somewhat on the braggadocious side about telling of their wartime exploits, they were usually suspect.
Yeah. Fascinating story, especially since I knew the family.
Yeah, right.
And I knew the people related to this.
Right.
Thank you so much again, Don, for sharing with us the
My
story
pleasure.
about our American heroes from Revere. If you wish to get any further information about any of these stories or stories that are not being told, the Revere Cultural and Historical Society, the preservation of the Revere culture and history, located across from the Immaculate Conception School, has a wealth of information, and they certainly invite you to visit them at any time. It's a fascinating place. We're going to be returning again with another in this series, Revere Another Time, and we'll be talking about a few more of our war heroes. Thank you very much, Don.
You're welcome.